Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to chat about what I learned about writing from The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. So there's really so much to get into here, but I really wanted to focus in on one thing that stood out to me while reading, which is the way that Bennett uses point of view and perspective, and her narrator especially, to establish the themes and characters within the story. I thought that she did this in a really subtle and nuanced way that I really enjoyed, and I learned a lot from it as a writer as well. And so without further ado, here's what I learned about writing from The Vanishing Half. So this is an adult novel set in the 1960s and 70s, and it follows the story of two twins who are light-skinned African Americans. And when they grow up, one of them, named Stella, decides to move away from the small town that they've lived in their whole lives. The town is called Mallard, and to pass as white, while the other twin, called Desiree, decides to return to Mallard and brings her dark-skinned black daughter with her. The story sort of encompasses both the twins' lives and those of their daughters, who meet each other without realizing at first that they're related. So there are sort of two centers of this story. The first one is the town, Mallard, and I guess it's really interesting that this town, even though it's sort of a thematic and psychological center of the story, it's this really small town, and it's so small in fact that you can't even find it on a map. It's a place that people want to get away from. It's sort of unmemorable. And Bennett writes, Mallard had always been more of an idea than a place, and an idea couldn't be redefined by geographical terms. So that's one center of the story. And then the other one, I would argue, is the narrator. Now, in some ways, the narrator is sort of just as elusive as Mallard itself, because we never find out who they are, but their voice shapes the story in a lot of ways, both consciously and subconsciously. So that's really what I want to dig in today, and this video will be in two parts. The first talking about sort of how Bennett establishes her narrator, and the second talking about how she uses the narrator and point of view and perspective to characterize one of the characters, Stella. So how does Bennett establish and use this narrator? The book is in third person, but the narrator is a really distinct figure, I think, and their voice has a huge impact on the story. And I think Bennett establishes this figure of the narrator through three methods: establishing their voice, their knowledge or opinions, and their stance or position. So the first is voice, and I guess this is a pretty standard thing to talk about when you're talking about narration. And I think it's even important in this case when the narrator is not a character who appears explicitly in the story. The narrator's voice is really quite distinct, and they often comment on events. So one example is when one character asks, "Desiree seemed like the type to take in an orphan to you?" And the narrator answers in an internal monologue of sorts, "Of course she didn't. She was a selfish girl." So you can see here that this quote establishes a really strong voice for the narrator, the voice that's commenting and almost judging the characters. Now, the second part is the narrator's knowledge and opinions, and that we saw a little bit of that earlier in the previous quote, but I think it's really interesting that the narrator speaks both for the town's collective knowledge, the things that they know as a community, and in some cases for a sort of objective truth that the townspeople would have no way of knowing. So, for example, their disappearance seemed as sudden as the rapture all of Mallard the sinners left behind. Naturally, the truth was neither sinister nor mystical. Twins soon surfaced in New Orleans, selfish girls running from responsibility. So in this case, this piece of information that the twins soon arrived in New Orleans, that's something that the townspeople would have no way of knowing, but the narrator knows, and they let us as readers in on that information. But at the same time, this quote sort of slips back into editorializing, and you'll notice that the judgment on the characters, this judgment of selfishness, is actually repeated from the last quote that we looked at. And this comment is sort of made in the same internal monologue / commentary style from earlier. And so you can see that the narrator is very purposefully shaping the way that readers see these events and these characters. And in fact, it's sometimes hard to tell where objective fact ends and the narrator's own opinions begin. And so as readers, we're sort of questioning whether we understand events and characters as well as we think we do, or whether this is just how the narrator wants us to understand them. And of course, that's a major theme of the book. So Bennett ties in that idea, that theme, with the way that she executes this narrator themselves. And the last way that Bennett fleshes out this narrator is through their sort of stance or position in society. Now, this is somewhat related to opinions, I guess, but the narrator basically is not an omniscient figure, nor do they encompass all viewpoints at once, but rather it's clear that they're coming from a very particular position in society, even if they might have more information that someone within the actual society of the book could have. We can see this when the narrator sometimes introduces outside viewpoints to add another perspective to events. So one example of this is when a priest comes from Dublin to Mallard and wonders, was this who counted for colored in America, who whites wanted to keep separate? Well, how could they ever tell the difference? And this is after the priest remarks on all of the light-skinned, fair-haired people who live in Mallard, who have been racially marked as black in America. So this priest's point of view is a perspective outside of the sort of systems of race in America. And so the priest doesn't understand this system in which the light-skinned and light-haired people who live in Mallard still identify as black and are considered to be black. And of course this is also a subtle way of introducing one of the main questions of the novel, which is what race means and how we think about it in America. And I think it's really clever the way that Bennett does this without losing the sense of a really specific narrator. So bringing in some outside figure, the priest, rather than using the narrator's voice or an omniscient voice to comment on these events. So overall, even though we don't know who exactly the narrator is, we get a sense of how they're positioned in relation to some of these issues, such as race and systems of race in America. And I think it's important to note that Bennett's narrator does influence the way that readers see all of the events and all of the characters and ideas in the novel. And Bennett reminds us of this fact sort of subtly by including all of these hints that I was talking about, that the narrator is a real person, a real figure with a position in society, rather than some sort of all-knowing, objective force that just tells the truth. And so then you begin to wonder, I mean, not exactly that this narrator is unreliable per se, in the sense of a usual unreliable narrator, but they have definite opinions. And as I was saying before, that really helps Bennett to explore this theme of questioning the narratives that we are fed, both as readers and as just people living in society, living in America. Beyond the way that Bennett introduces and establishes and reminds readers of this narrator, this figure of the narrator throughout the book, the second thing that was really interesting to me about her use of point of view and perspective was how she uses these things to characterize Stella, who's the twin who decides to pass as white. So obviously she uses all of the usual techniques of characterization, the, just straight up descriptions, dialogue, actions, all of those things. But I was really struck by the fact that the way she uses the narrator to describe Stella and to sort of create an image or almost a myth around her, which I'll talk about later, the way that Bennett does that was just as important a part of her characterization. And I thought that was a really interesting mode of characterization that I hadn't thought about before and that I really want to incorporate into my own writing. So the first way that Bennett uses the narrator to do this is by building up a very external image of Stella, sort of what the narrator and what other characters think of her before we even get to see her perspective and through her eyes. And oftentimes this, especially in the beginning, is a very visual image. So for example, Bennett writes, Stella, curly hair pinned into a ponytail, tied with a ribbon. Her dress is always starched. Shoes shined. A girl still, since that was the only way Desiree had ever known her. So this is the way that Desiree views Stella, and this really vivid and really clear image is the image of Stella that sticks with readers. But there's also sort of a broader mythology around Stella that comes out in the ways that characters both describe her and don't describe her, and that creates almost an aura around her that goes beyond just her physical characteristics. So for example, Desiree thinks that she sees her everywhere, whereas the twins' mom says that she doesn't think about her at all. And then take a look at this quote. The twins had always seemed both blessed and cursed. They'd inherited from their mother the legacy of an entire town, and from their father a lineage hollowed by loss. So whereas Desiree has point of view sections from her own perspective to flesh out this mythologized vision of the twins, Stella doesn't have those sections at first. It doesn't have that perspective that readers can see. And so she remains throughout the book this sort of unknowable twin, the one that even her daughter can't fully understand, and that, even readers, of course, can't fully understand either. And it's actually not until part 3 of the novel that we see Stella in person for any extended period of time, and even then, it's actually through the perspective of other people, so her husband, her neighbors in the predominantly white neighborhood that she's moved into. And so the first time that readers see Stella directly is actually through the perspective of people who she's deceived. And then even when we finally get to her own perspective, her point of view, it's in a chapter that starts from her husband's point of view, which I thought was really telling. And overall, just these descriptions of her, whether you're considering her through the eyes of her mother, her twin sister, her neighbors, her husband, her daughter even, regardless of whose eyes you're looking at her through, there's this sense that you can never really grasp her. And this is one of the most important aspects of her character, and I thought it was really interesting the way that Bennett used the descriptions of her through the narrator's voice to create a really strong impression of this characteristic. And there are, I think, a couple of really telling quotes here that I just wanted to point out and talk about briefly. The first one is this. Stella's daughter spoke about her mother wistfully, the way that everyone talked about Stella. And then there's another quote later on. Stella had spent too long lying to tell the truth now, or maybe there was nothing left to reveal. Maybe this was who she had become. So here, even the narrator, who has knowledge beyond what an ordinary person would have, even the narrator is not sure whether Stella has changed on a fundamental level or if it's more on the level of belief and appearance. And I thought it was really interesting to compare these external depictions of her to when we finally get her own point of view. And of course, that's a much more traditional method of character development. But in her point of view, you get a very strong sense that she is conflicted about who she is. And so the way that the narrator has built up her character, this mythologized aspect to her, that's supported in her own point of view when we do get that. So overall, I think it was really telling how Bennett withholds Stella's point of view for a long time and then paints multiple pictures of her through the eyes of other characters, and just this overall use of point of view and perspective to characterize her I thought was one of the really interesting aspects of this book. So that's it for what I learned about writing, what I learned about perspective and narrator from The Vanishing Half. If you've read it, what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the book, and also other books that you think use narration and point of view in really interesting ways. I was just reading 13 Doorways, Wolves Behind Them All, and I thought that it was done really well in that book as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about others. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified when I post a new video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.